All right, folks. Showtime.
From America's first people, through early explorers, settlers, pioneers, immigrants of the past and today. This is our American heritage.
When I was a little girl, I used to walk along this very path with my grandmother. We would spend the time looking at the forest, the lake, the mountains in the distance, and the many animals who lived in those places. She had to be very patient with me because I always had so many questions. I would look out upon this beautiful land and wonder, who were the first people to live here? Who fished in these rivers? Who hunted in these very forests? Who lived farther away than I could see? Hundreds, even thousands of years ago. You see, Grandmother was very wise and always seemed to have an answer for me. In her stories.
Come on, Grandma.
Stories that took me to long ago and to far and near, almost as if I were there myself. And what wonderful stories they were. She told me of the great tribes, how they got to this land, where they lived, what they were like. She told me the story of how, at one time, thousands of years ago, the water level of the oceans dropped, and a land bridge was formed between the great land of Asia and our North America. She says our people traveled across this land bridge to make their home here and other parts of this land. Grandmother spoke of these people as though they were one big family because they had so much in common. She said that all the different people had great respect for nature because they depended on nature for everything they needed to live. It was this respect for nature and their surroundings that brought harmony to all of these people. I once asked Grandmother if we were called Indians because we were from India. She laughed. She said that we were called Indians because when Christopher Columbus first came to North America, he thought he was in the East Indies. That was a mistake. We should have been called natives because we were the first people settled here. But Christopher Columbus thought he was in the East Indies, thus Indians. I did wonder how Grandmother knew all of this. She told me that the tribes told of their history through storytelling, fathers to sons, mothers to daughters, and granddaughters, through many generations. Because of this storytelling, I have learned much about the first people of this land. And now I will pass this knowledge on to the next generation. Grandmother told me that the tribes of North America were different from one another because of where they settled and how they learned to live with the resources available in each location. Natives settled in 6 basic areas: the Southeast, the Eastern Woodlands, the Great Plains, the Southwest, the California Intermountain region, and the Northwest Coast.
People of the Southeast.
In the Southeast area, the main tribe of people were the Cherokee. They lived in the river valleys of the southern Appalachian Mountains. This area also provided many natural resources to sustain their life. They grew corn, beans, squash, pumpkins, sunflowers, and tobacco. They gathered wild plants and berries from the forests. They fished and hunted squirrels, rabbits, turkeys, bears, and deer. The Cherokee had 2 types of houses, one type for the winter and one type for the summer. Their winter houses were small, cone-shaped pit houses made of wooden poles and covered with earth. Summer houses were larger, box-shaped houses with grass or clay walls and bark roofs. Cherokee houses were built close together to form villages. Sometimes there were 300 to 400 houses in the village. Each village had a chief who governed the village and told people what to do in day-to-day matters. The villages were all part of a larger Cherokee group called a confederation. Chiefs came from as many as 100 villages to discuss important matters regarding their confederation of village. One such important matter was war, because fighting was very common among the tribes in this area. To prepare for war, chiefs would hold a game in the villages called Little War, which was similar to lacrosse, but it had more players and fewer rules. One famous Cherokee was named Sequoyah. In 1809, he went to work on a written language for his people. He heard many stories that were passed down and was afraid the people might not remember them. He gave a symbol to each syllable sound of words, some of which he borrowed from the English and Greek languages, although the sounds were different. When he was done, he had 86 symbols in his alphabet. The Cherokee became the first Native American tribe to have a written language. While the tribes in the southeast developed their own culture and language, tribes that had settled in the northeast were growing too. The region on the eastern coast of North America was known as the Eastern Woodland Area.
People of the Eastern Woodlands.
It got its name from the many forests that were, at times, so thick that sunlight never touched the ground. It had snow-covered mountains in the north and hot, wet swamps in the southern part of this region. This was the home of a people known as the Iroquois. The tribes of the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk were all considered Iroquois people. The population of an Iroquois village could be anywhere from 50 to 1,000 people. They lived together in long houses, which were rectangular buildings made from the wood and bark of elm trees. This region was rich in natural resources. They farmed the rich soil, hunted for bear, deer, ducks, and other animals, and fished in lakes and streams for trout and salmon. Often their villages grew up on the bluffs next to rivers. As the region became crowded, groups began fighting over natural resources and land. Eventually, a Mohawk by the name of Hiawatha was able to convince each of the 5 Iroquois groups to unite and form the Iroquois Confederacy. The Confederacy was ruled by a Grand Council. This Grand Council was made up of 50 men, known as sachems, and their decisions affected all Iroquois. They discussed war, peace, and trade with other Native Americans. Some historians think that the Iroquois Confederacy may have provided a model for the government of our country. West of the Appalachian Mountains were miles of flat, dry grasslands and gently rolling hills. These were called the Great Plains.
People of the Plains.
Natural resources in the Great Plains area were difficult to find. Among the natives that settled in the Great Plains were the Mandans. They lived along the Missouri River in what is presently North Dakota. Mandans built circular houses called lodges. Lodges were houses built over a shallow pit and covered with sod, which is a mixture of grass and dirt. The Mandans did some farming, which was primarily done by the women. The men of the tribe hunted for food and to have pelts to trade. Twice a year the villages emptied for the buffalo hunt. The people, including women and children, walked several days from their villages to the grassy areas of the plains. Once there, the men would do the hunting. While wearing animal skins as disguises, the men would surround several buffalo. At a signal, they would all shout and drive the buffalo off a steep cliff where they would fall and be killed. After the hunt, the women skinned the buffalo and prepared the buffalo for many purposes, such as jerky, clothing, blankets, water carriers, rope, and tools. Another Indian tribe that hunted buffalo was the Kiowa. Unlike the Mandans, the Kiowa were known to move a lot. They roamed the Great Plains. They too used all parts of the buffalo to sustain their life. They even used their refuse, called buffalo chips, for fuel in their fires. Because they followed the buffalo, their homes were made so they could be easily moved. These homes were called teepees. The Kiowas set wooden poles together and tied them at the top. They covered the poles with buffalo skins, leaving a hole at the top for smoke from their fires to escape. Another group that lived on the Great Plains was the Lakota, also known as the Sioux. The Lakota also hunted and traveled with the buffalo, so they too lived in teepees. When Spanish colonists arrived, they brought horses with them. The Lakota learned to catch and breed the horses, so they could be used to hunt buffalo. Further south and west of the Great Plains, the land is mostly dry. It has rocky mesas, mountains, steep cliffs, and deep canyons.
People of the Southwest.
The natives of the Southwest learn to adapt to a land that is hot during the day and often gets very cold at night. Here it can be dry for months and then suddenly get a storm that produces flash floods. The Pueblo people were tribes that lived in adobe houses that were built next to or on top of one another. To enter a house or reach another level, the people climbed ladders. The earliest Pueblo people were the Anasazi. Signs of their culture date back as far as 500 A.D. The Hopi and Zuni were considered Pueblo people also. The Hopi men worked in the fields and hunted, while the Hopi women prepared meals in large stoves made of adobe, which was dried clay. The Southwest was home to the Navajo as well as the Pueblo people. The Navajo did not live in villages. Instead, they built their homes in small, family-sized groups, miles apart from one another. Their houses were called hogans, which were cone-shaped houses built by covering a log frame with mud and or grass. When Spanish explorers came to this area, from 1500 to the 1600s, they brought sheep, and this changed the Navajo way of life. They used wool to make blankets and clothing. The sheep were a source of food as well. In the west was a region known as the California Intermountain region. Many tribes made their homes in this lush area.
People of California.
The native people of this large area were as diverse as the environments they lived in, from the forests and rivers near today's border between California and Oregon, to the sand, rock, and cactus trees of the high desert on the southern end of the state. The native peoples here lived very different lives. Far south, the Mojave people farmed for much of their food in this hot climate. With little grass available for basket making, they learned to make pots of clay for cooking and storing food. Further north and extending west to the coast, the Chumash tribe discovered a unique natural resource. Tar bubbled up from the ground in their area. They used the tar to seal the seams in their canoes. With waterproof canoes, they were able to travel long distances up and down the coastline to trade with other tribes. The Miwok and the Maidu lived in the rich valley and mountains in the center of California. Near the coast, their homes were covered with wood and sod. Inland, their houses resembled teepees, but their supporting poles were covered with bark. Their summer homes were covered for shade and open-sided to let out the heat. Each village had a large round building at the center where they held meetings. Deep indentations in the rock were made by women as they ground acorns for flour. The surrounding forests and rivers were rich with animals and fish for food. Leaves and grasses were abundant for their beautiful and functional baskets. The young people of the village played games similar to present-day soccer, lacrosse, and football. North and on the Pacific coast, the Yurok tribe used the abundant redwood trees to build houses and canoes. They hunted deer for food and used antlers for tools. They gathered nuts and berries from the forest, grinding acorns into flour for bread. They also relied on the yearly salmon run for food. Still further north, the native people of the Northwest lived between the ocean and the mountain ranges.
People of the Northwest.
This land was mostly rivers and forest, which was not favorable to agriculture. The people here fished, hunted, and gathered plants for food. There was plenty of wood to make houses, tools, and dugout boats. Dugout boats were boats made from hollowed-out trees. Trade was common among the Indians here along the Columbia River. The Chinooks were the best-known traders of the Northwest coast. They traded many things such as dried fish, shells, furs, whale products, seal oil, cedar, dugout boats, masks, jewelry, baskets, copper, and prisoners. Families related to one another were called clans, and these clans lived in houses called pit houses, made of wooden boards with no windows. They were called a pit house because part of the house was over a hole in the ground, and some of its rooms were underground. The Makas were another Indian tribe who lived on the northwest coast. Like the Chinook, the Maka built houses from wood. The Maka tribe is famous for the totem poles that were in front of each house. The totem pole is a tall wooden post that was carved in great detail. These totems would show people and animals. They would also show a family's history. The Maka were known for their great whale hunts. They prepared for months, building canoes, making wooden harpoons, and shaping paddles. Nothing on the whale went to waste. People ate the meat and skin. Even the fat was melted for fuel. Grandmother's stories of the Native Americans brought to me visions of a great people and helped me understand who they were and how they differed from each other as they adapted to the location and the resources in the southeast, the eastern woodlands, the Great Plains, the southwest, the California Intermountain region, and the northwest coast. Grandmother's lessons taught me to hold on to what is good in life, even when life changes. At first, I didn't know what she meant, but she told me that eventually, people from the new lands would come to this country and many changes would take place in the world of the Native Americans. And Grandmother was right. There were changes when the new people came to this country, but the Native Americans held true to their beliefs and traditions because they knew what was good in life, and they passed that goodness down to their children. Sometimes I miss the talks with Grandmother and the lessons I learned. But I have found that when I pass these stories along to others, I know that in some ways, Grandmother is with me.
For more great curriculum-coordinated programs, call 1-800-483-3383 or visit us online at schoolvideos.com.